take some time and model the change that you would like to see. Because traditionally intervention approaches tend to be this, kind of isolating, almost shameful dynamic, right? Of you have a problem and you need to go to rehab and you're a terrible person and you, right? Where when we can shift that messaging that this family is sick, and I can see the husband or the wife of the person take accountability for, here's how I've contributed to the dysfunction. Maybe it's not my fault that it exists in the first place, but here is how I'm contributing to it and how it's affecting me. And when we can start to see all the other family members surrounding them take some of that same approach where they're all taking a personal accountability, good Lord, does that destroy all the manipulations so effectively, right? Patients are being surrounded by a lot more resources post-treatment than they ever have been in the past, right? There are recovery resources at your fingertips 24/7, and it's really cool to see the treatment centers really evolve into that. You know, what I'd like to see more of, what my vision is that we're going to start incorporating the families to a much bigger degree. I think in our industry, there's a big pushback. I wouldn't say pushback, but today it's not financially advantageous, right? Family services aren't really billable to insurance. And that's one thing we're really out to change is to gather the data on what happens to outcomes when you do comprehensive family services. And that's my real vision, is to see that not only is our family services reimbursable by insurance, but they're standard, right? That it becomes weird if you're not doing this.
Welcome to the Brainwaves podcast by Opus, where we sit down with industry leaders to unpack their journeys, explore key challenges, and talk about how they're shaping the future of behavioral health and healthcare innovation. I'm your host, Sean Rickenbacker. Today's episode focuses on a topic that resonates deeply with everyone touched by addiction: how engaging families and inspiring personal transformation can change lives. Our guest today is Andrew Engbring, a leader in the behavioral health field known for his compassionate, family-centered approach to recovery. Through his work, Drew has helped countless individuals find lasting change, not just by addressing addiction itself, but by involving the people who mattered most in the healing process. Whether it's the way he creates meaningful roles for family members in the treatment journey, or how he motivates clients to take ownership of their recovery, Drew's approach is equal parts heart, strategy, and accountability. Drew, thanks again for joining me today on the Brainwaves podcast. To start us off, can you share a bit about what inspired you to get into this work?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sean. Yeah, I think I found my way into this industry like a great many, right? From a personal story. Did a great job of destroying myself and absolutely everybody around me, right? Specifically found my way into the intervention space, because I didn't start in the intervention world, right? I started in a sober, working in a sober living home and through the treatment space, right? Between detoxes and residential and partial hospitalization care. And, I saw it happen over and over and over again, where somebody would be doing fantastic while they were in the program, and then we'd send them home and everything crumbled, right? And all the while, there were families that were either too detached, too involved, and virtually every single time, the program just did not have the bandwidth, the capacity, the releases of information to truly help the family system. And so families were left with little more than a pamphlet and some instructions to go to Al-Anon, right? And we started taking clients from an intervention company that was offering some family support along with that intervention. And bottom line, the outcomes of those clients were significantly greater. They would come in a little more resistant than most, fighting the process, fighting the fact that they were in treatment, that they didn't want to stop using, right? But we could easily enough lead them through that because that's pretty textbook. Virtually everybody coming into treatment has some days they don't want to be there, right? Regardless of how they found their way in the door.
Absolutely.
And I noticed this intervention organization, the clients just did better. They did better in treatment. They were more likely to follow through with aftercare. The families were easier to work with. They were taking accountability for themselves. And that's what really inspired the journey of, comprehensive family work. in watching just how much better a treatment episode could go when somebody was paying attention to the family system, right? Where are we discharging these people to? And that's ultimately was the inspiration for my wife and I to found Reflection. Was we wanted to create something to where there was comprehensive support, education for the family so they could find their own healing and ultimately produce better outcomes for themselves and their loved one.
I love that. Love that. I think it happens all too often where it comes from a personal experience, kind of leading people to start recovery centers. But I think that, having experienced that firsthand helps us as individuals to try to help other people through it. And I
Right.
love that your journey brought you there. You mentioned that, obviously it started from when you, as you said, destroyed your own life. But what were you doing before you got into, or before you started Reflection?
Before I started Reflection, I was actually working for an intervention company.
Oh,
I
that's right.
was their chief executive officer for a number of years. And was really able to help in developing out a full-on family program with that organization. Um, Ran into some limitations, right? Of course, it can only be so much your baby, right? When
Yep.
you're when you're not actually ownership of an organization. So I've been in the intervention space for some time, and it's just such a blessing now that we have the complete freedom, right, to do exactly what we feel is the right thing to do and what's necessary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So tell me, Drew, I know you've got a reputation for being both inspiring and real, holding people accountable while also giving them hope. Have you always had this approach, or how has it evolved over time?
I think more or less it was beaten into me in the beginning.
I get that. Yep.
You know, I had a mentor that was not an easy man to get along with. And no matter what my issue was, he was always, Drew, what's your part? What's your part? What's your part? Look at yourself. Look at yourself. What do you mean? They're jerks. They're jerks. Don't worry. No, 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 no. You are the maker of your own problems, right? And I didn't quite, I mean, I believed him in the moment, but I didn't quite understand what he was saying until, honestly, years later. And today, what I can really take that to mean is that regardless of what happens to us or our family members or any of the problems around us, regardless of the cause of the problems, we are absolutely accountable for why are we in that situation? Why do we participate in that situation? Do we continue to participate in that? And what are we going to do about the future? And it's really grown into something just quite beautiful when I can empower the family members to stop putting the focus on their loved ones' mental health or substance use disorder or process addiction or whatever their loved one's doing, right?
Yep.
Whatever they're doing, it's take some time and model the change that you would like to see. Because traditionally, intervention approaches tend to be this, kind of isolating, almost shameful dynamic, right? Of you have a problem and you need to go to rehab and you're a terrible person and you, right? Where when we can shift that messaging that this family is sick, and I can see the husband or the wife of the person take accountability for here's how I've contributed to the dysfunction. Maybe it's not my fault that it exists in the first place, but here is how I'm contributing to it and how it's affecting me. And when we can start to see all the other family members surrounding them take some of that same approach where they're all taking a personal accountability, good Lord, does that destroy all the manipulations so effectively, right? Because we're not ganging up on one person and telling them to go to treatment anymore. Everybody's just taking their time to say, here's how I'm contributing to the problem, and here's what I can commit to doing differently in the future, right? I'm no longer part of this cycle. The best part about that is you destroy all levels of treatment resistance pretty darn quickly once they see that everybody around them is taking accountability for themselves, right? And when you're the only one in the room who's not accountable to yourself, that turns into kind of a lonely life very quickly. You
Absolutely.
know, it's the best approach, right? Model or mirror the change. That's why we call the company reflection, right? You know, look in your reflection, be the change that you want to see in your family. Because if you can start modeling the behavior, then they might follow suit.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. We obviously on the podcast speak with a lot of different recovery centers since we focus heavily on substance use treatment, addiction, etc. But you're the first family intervention person I've spoken to. One common thing that all these treatment centers have said is it's all about community. You know, like you mentioned, we focus so heavily on the individual. What am I doing wrong, etc. But it's also very important, as you mentioned before, when they go home after treatment in order to continue their recovery journey. It's so important to have that community support. And I love that you get the family involved. It sounds like it's the family that's in treatment as opposed to the individual.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, really, both sides, right? We get the
Yep.
individual into their program, but that's absolutely right. Community is everything. You know, there's all kinds of fun expressions, right? One of my favorite ones is if you hang around in the barber shop long enough, you're going to get a haircut, right?
Yep.
You know, what kind of community are we sending people back to after treatment, right? What does that actually look like? One way I've heard it described that I really liked was the addiction itself is like a tornado, right? And tornadoes spin and spiral and spin and spiral, and they suck everything else up into the wind with them,
Yep.
right? The person, the dog, grandma, the house, everything is just
Yep.
spinning and spiraling around that addiction. Now we take a patient and we put them in treatment, and it starts to go wonderful. They're calm, they become collected, they're getting therapy, they're practicing mindfulness, they're taking accountability for themselves, right? They're doing well. And they get on the phone with their family, and it's everything we've ever hoped and dreamed of. But in the meantime, if there's nobody paying attention to that system on the outside, they continue to spiral while this person's in treatment. That if we put them back into a system that's spinning, we just spin
Yep.
them right back out with us.
Absolutely.
Whereas when we can calm that community to where we're actually discharging them to a recovery community that understands how to support, it's real magic. One of the metaphors I like to use with our clients is so it's pretty well accepted that addiction, substance use disorders, process addictions, right? Mental health disorders, it's pretty well accepted that these are illnesses, right? That these are diseases. You know, that's fairly common knowledge now. Yet, very few times do we actually treat it that way. You know, and so the example I like to use is if I was married to a diabetic, or I loved somebody with diabetes, or I had a child who was diabetic, I would be taking classes on what is diabetes. I would be learning about blood sugar and glucose levels. I would be learning when do I give them a hard candy? When do I give them a Diet Coke? How does insulin work, right? I would be learning everything I could about their illness and how to support them. And if I found somebody that I desperately, dearly love with diabetes just on the couch with an entire chocolate cake in their lap and they're just wolfing the whole thing down,
Yep.
I would have absolutely zero guilt in ripping that cake out of their lap, throwing it in the garbage, putting something nasty on top of it, right? I wouldn't
Yeah.
care that they were mad because I know, to eat that cake could spell death. But why don't support systems approach a substance use disorder the same way? You know, so many times I hear, well, it's their problem, not mine.
Mhm.
Well, that may be true, but you're part of the problem. You're absolutely a part of it, right? Why is it so difficult for families to take that level of accountability that they would treat a mental health disorder in the same way that we would treat loving somebody with diabetes? Education, support, boundaries, accountability, right? Getting involved in how this person's illness works and how recovery works and how do we support them through that. You know, and that's what we really want to provide on the intervention side
I love
is
that.
is that level of education that you can truly help somebody walk their path. You know, our industry as a whole has done a really good job. I think one of the biggest levels or points of resistance that I see is if you say the dreaded E or the C words, right? The very scary enabling word, the very scary codependency, right? Every time I bring up that word, I get guilt and shame and anger reactions, right? People get defensive very quickly. You're saying it's my fault, right? And our industry has done a wonderful job of using these as shame terms, that you're doing something wrong. And in my experience, it's really safety seeking in trauma. It feels safer to enable. It feels safer to help. It feels safer to not hold them accountable or hold myself accountable, right? It just feels safer that way. And so, of course, we have to go through a lot of effort to overcome that guilt and the shame. And when we say enabling, we're not saying it's your fault. We're not saying that you caused the problem. We're simply saying that you're part of the problem and you need to take some personal accountability for the solution.
Absolutely. With that, how do you approach a family member who might be hesitant to like take that accountability and really be involved in that process?
I mean, like anything, it depends on what you have going on in front of you, right? What's really happening. But one of the best questions you can start with is asking yourself, why don't they want help? What is making a destructive lifestyle more comfortable than the solution, right? Why are they comfortable in their illness? And then what am I doing, right? What are my actions? And so you start by looking in the mirror. With every way I'm addressing this today, am I providing actual accountability or just temporary quiet or temporary peace? Because a lot of times what feels safe in the moment, right, is peaceful, right? Just this temporary peace. I enable them because I need a nap. I need them to stop yelling or screaming. I'm afraid that if I don't, that's going to make things worse, right? And with each of my actions, am I just buying myself a little bit of temporary peace? Am I just kicking the can further down the road, or are we actually pursuing real long-term solution? And so you start by taking that personal accountability. How am I contributing to making this problem comfortable? Because once you can answer that question, not do I enable, but why do I do it? If you can answer that question for yourself, the words for your loved one are going to come a lot more naturally.
With that, once you answer that question of why do I enable uh, for your like my family members, how do you help somebody to kind of overcome that inertia? They're at rest, they're trying to keep the peace. How do you help them to get the courage to, I guess, fully love their family members and care for them and take that accountability?
We got to figure out what the enabling is providing for you. Is it a generational trauma thing? We see that all the time. There was maybe there was some type of substance use with my parents or in the generation before me, and that's how I learned about how to behave around these types of issues. Maybe we have a family culture of avoidance tactics, and we just don't confront the hard things. Maybe the last time I just don't have confidence or the proper education or even know how, right? Because the last time I tried to confront the issue, they got mad, they got angry, they put a hole through the wall, they left, right? But I've got to see, what is it doing for me? What's the benefit, right? Is it a little bit of temporary peace? Is it safety seeking? What's the benefit to me to enabling dysfunction? Because when I can start to understand what the benefit is to me, then I can start to look at, well, how do I get that benefit somewhere else? Is this really giving me the effect that I'm looking for? I do this exercise when I'm running family groups. Before even like talking about what enabling is, how it works, any of that, right? I'll get this whole group of family members and just, hey, why do you enable your person? And I always get some variation of, well, they get mad at me if I don't, right? I just needed some peace and quiet. I'm scared. It's always about me. Protecting my peace, protecting my comfort, protecting the dysfunction, preserving dysfunctional family roles, sometimes they can get a little darker, right? And that, well, if I truly confront this addiction, it might expose issues in my own relationship or in our marriage or wherever else we have going on, right? But everybody always answers that question with some means of self-preservation. You know what nobody has ever answered the why do you enable question with? Because I thought it would help them get better. I thought it would help them get sober. I thought I was helping them get to treatment. Nobody has ever answered the question with that. And I think in our hearts, we all know we're not helping the situation when we're doing it. Like, we all know it in our hearts. And I know this isn't what we feel in our hearts, but a lot of times what our actions will say is that I'm more concerned with my feelings than I am with saving their life. I'm more concerned with protecting my feelings than I am with protecting their well-being. To tell a mother, father, husband, wife, whoever, right? Hey, stop enabling your loved one. It's like telling an addict, hey, you should just stop using. Or an alcoholic, hey, why don't you just stop drinking? Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Why didn't I think of that, right?
Yeah.
If it was that simple, there wouldn't be these resources, right? We have to understand what the benefit is to us, right? And then we can start to see, well, if I'm getting benefit from the dysfunction, how do I replace that, right? And then I can start to define, what does my recovery mean as a family member? How can I confidently say I'm in recovery? What would that even look like for me, regardless of their outcome? Let's say they never get better. What about my recovery? What about my bottom? What about my turn to heal? How can I model the change?
I think back to what we said before about like the individual versus the community, right? People tend to turn inwards, like you said, like they're trying to preserve themselves. But it's only when they turn outwards towards their family members that they love that they're able to help them along their recovery journey. Sounds like a lot of the work you do on the family side is helping a group of individuals become a community as opposed
Yeah,
to siloed. I love that.
that's exactly right.
Tell me, Drew, have you seen a moment where there was a breakthrough with a family that really shifted someone's recovery path? Feel free to share, anonymous, of course, that, of course, captures the power of this kind of involvement.
Right. So there's two that really come immediate to mind, that we've actually recently graduated from our. So we do a 6-month family program as part of the intervention process. And there's two families that immediately come to mind. So story one, there's a young lady. She's young to mid 30s, just in a really bad way. Fentanyl, benzodiazepines, whatever she could get her hands on, right? She's not likely to make it till Christmas, right? It just was not looking good at all. She had a couple sisters and a brother, 3 sisters and a brother. And then mom and dad had been separated, not divorced, but separated. So we go to emergency intervention process, right? There's a severe crisis right in front of us that needs to be addressed immediately, right? As soon as possible. So they had called on a Wednesday and we had an interventionist with them on Thursday, right? I mean, just let's go now, right? We don't need to mess around with this. Let's move. And so we go through the intervention process, and that takes a couple of days, but like most, we're not too far into the intervention process, and she says, okay, yeah, I'll go into treatment. Like most, she's not excited about it, she's not happy about it, but she's willing, right? She's willing to do something different, because that's what the intervention does, is it really breaks down these barriers that I can see that there's serious benefit to making this decision today. And of course we take away all the excuses, right? Like it's a yes or no answer, right? We've
Yep.
already figured out the pets and the job and the insurance. Like, we figured everything out, right? Just walk in the
Yep.
door. It's all set up for you.
Yep.
There's a mint on the pillow. It's waiting for you.
Yep.
Now, the family is going through our program, and it very quickly becomes it comes to the surface that there's a lot of resentment between these kids and mom and dad. Um, Mom and dad didn't have the strongest parental track records to say it nicely, right? These kids had grown up without a lot of structure or consistency, and some things that we all wish wouldn't have happened, right? Um, and as we're going through this take accountability for yourself kind of program, right? And why do you act the way you act? Why do you operate the way you operate? What are you protecting? Um, the brother comes out and says, I think I have a problem with alcohol too. So we help him to get into a treatment program. Not too far after that, dad says, I think I've got a problem with cannabis. And he seeks therapy. And he's getting his own individual therapy, right? One of the sisters was already in therapy, and the other one says, I should probably get some therapy myself. So now I've got the entire family engaged in their own support outside of the family program, right? Every one of them is. A couple of months go by. The two that were in treatment, right? The initial intervention girl and the brother, they're back in the family program with us. And then we start processing our family resentments, right? What are we really holding? And anybody in recovery is familiar with this exercise, right? But as we're processing our resentments and our anger and our fears, a big stickler for what's my part in that. And every one of these kids had a very shared anger and pain point with their parents, that they didn't model what a good relationship looked like for me. Dad was certainly verbally and sometimes physically abusive. Mom didn't show me how to stand up for myself. They all had a very, very similar resentment that our parents weren't parents to us. And so, of course, them identifying what's their part in this, right? And of course, the goal is not blame a child for their parents' behavior, right? But what is your part? And they couldn't figure it out. And finally, it was like, well, you're all adults now, and yet you're still hanging on to that. You ended up burying yourself in fentanyl and benzodiazepines. You buried yourself in cannabis. You buried yourself in alcohol. You buried yourself with control. You buried yourself in avoidance. Every one of you took on an incredibly dysfunctional way of coping with adulthood. You know what was equally available to you all this time? Therapy, resources, support, mentorship, groups, right? You've had all of these resources at your disposal your entire life, and that you chose not to use them, and you chose to use dysfunctional and harmful coping mechanisms, right? And through that exercise, Dad was able to talk about, immigrating from a war-torn country and never really having parents of his own, right? Growing up with a battlefield outside his front door, right? And how he didn't really know, right? His primary goal was provide for the family, which financially he did very well. Um, and they were all able to start taking accountability that, about 5 months into our family program, they're laughing, they're cutting up, dad's allowed to babysit the grandkids again. I don't know if mom and dad are going to get back together, but their relationship is more connected than it ever was during their marriage. And they're even continuing on their family recovery meetings, even, after services have ended, right? That they finally found that connection. Every one of them had been craving, and yet nobody was willing to, for lack of a better expression, get naked first, right? Who's going to strip down and look at themselves in the mirror honestly first? Because when they all started to do that and take accountability for themselves, they could get vulnerable with each other and have better communication with each other and truly connect on a deeper level, that the family today is healthier than they've ever been. And sure, it started with the crisis point of an emergency fentanyl intervention. Mm-hmm. But in integrating everybody together post-treatment, we saw some beautiful things happen. I don't know. I guess that's my favorite recent memory story.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. I definitely, I think it helps our viewers here see the value in getting the family involved. It sounds like you were able to be a homemaker at that point, really bringing the family together, regardless if mom and dad are getting back together, but they're able to come together again as a community. I want to circle back to something. I know you mentioned you had a mentor who was a little bit tough on you. And of course, from that, you learned a lot about ownership and personal responsibility. How do you balance that sort of like tough love with empathy, especially early on in treatment?
The same. Confrontation doesn't have to be confrontational, right? We can confront behavior without being a jerk. They're really one and the same. When we can truly feel your pain, see your manipulation, see where your brain's playing tricks on itself, and confront that, we don't have to do it in a harmful way. And so tough love doesn't have to be something harsh. It may not be what you want to hear, but I can still convey that message with love and dignity and respect. And bottom line, it's when people feel that you genuinely care about them and you're not just trying to beat them into submission, the messaging comes off pretty well. It really does. So I don't really see a separation there. They can be and they are one and the same if we have genuine concern and love for the person that we're trying to help.
Yeah, I definitely agree. If we've got that genuine love and empathy for somebody, we're not afraid of being tough on them because we know that we want to see them survive. Like you mentioned, if you were married to somebody with diabetes and you see them eating all that cake and sugar, you would intervene. You want what's best for them because you genuinely care for them. I love that. You also mentioned previously that before you started Reflections with your wife, you were the CEO of another intervention company. What are some, I guess, distinct things that you brought into Reflections, like things that you wanted your ideal family interventions center to have?
I wanted it to include reintegration of the loved one post treatment. I'd say that was one of the biggest pieces that was missing to that puzzle that I really wanted. Was that after the loved one, the family gets their help and stability, the loved one gets theirs in treatment, right? But there really weren't any services to tie it all together. And that was one of the biggest pieces that we're huge proponents of. Now that we're able to do it with our own organization, I mean, it works exactly like you'd expect it to work. It's a little dicey at first, and when everybody gets over their own emotions, right, we turn into something legitimately beautiful, right? And when we can integrate all those recovery processes together and get them to work together, of course that increases outcomes. I mean, it's common sense. But one of the hard parts is there's just nobody really, really doing that yet. Nobody's really, really providing those services yet. And so we're honored to be in the beginning stages of that. That I'm convinced it won't be too much longer before that's standard practice in our industry.
I love that. You're definitely a pioneer. Like I've mentioned, we've spoken to plenty of addiction treatment centers, and I haven't spoken to anybody that does family interventions like Reflections does. So it's again awesome to have you on the podcast. Um, Looking ahead in the next 5 or 10 years, what's your vision for how treatment should evolve, especially in the way that we're engaging families and motivating people for lasting recovery?
I mean, there's what I would want, and then what's practical, right?
Yep. Yep.
In a perfect world, what I would want is that everybody takes a little bit of time off of work, off of everything to work on themselves, right? But that's almost never practical, right? Getting one person into a program is hard enough. Good luck getting their whole family to go at the same time, right?
Yep.
Um, but I certainly see a lot of trends becoming much better integrated. Especially with patient follow up from the providers. I'm seeing providers doing a better job of following and checking in, and with all the technologies. And this is one of the blessings of COVID, right? People got so much more comfortable with remote and virtual type services that I'm seeing that the patients are being surrounded by a lot more resources post treatment than they ever have been in the past, right? There are recovery resources at your fingertips 24/7, and it's really cool to see the treatment centers really, really evolve into that. Um, what I'd like to see more of, what my vision is that we're going to start incorporating the families to a much bigger degree. I think in our industry there's a big pushback. I wouldn't say pushback, but today it's not financially advantageous, right? Family services aren't really billable to insurance. And that's one thing we're really out to change is to gather the data on what happens to outcomes when you do comprehensive family services. And that's my real vision, is to see that not only is our family services reimbursable by insurance, but they're standard, right? That it becomes weird if you're not doing this.
Absolutely. Again, I love reflection family interventions approach to those interventions, the treatment of substance use disorders. I think it's fantastic. Of course, you are pioneers in the space. So again, thank you so much for being on the show. Um, I want to be respectful of your time, so I'll ask one more question, a little off topic, but I always ask this. Do you have any book recommendations?
Book recommendations? When the problem becomes the solution. Dr. Michael Barnes. That's the latest book that I've read that I'm in love with. Um, I read that one about a year ago, and I actually reworked a lot of our family program as a result of that. Right? Um, that's a great one. And then, I mean, if we're talking fiction, I mean, go back and reread the Harry Potters.
Yeah. My wife and I were just talking about how those will probably go down as classics. Like everybody reads the Mark Twain stuff from years before, and when my kids, your kids are in school, they'll probably be reading Harry Potter as a classic. So it's kind of
Yeah,
crazy, huh?
we're buying the illustrated ones as they come out, right? Because they're reprinting them all with gorgeous illustrations.
Mhm.
So we're buying them all again with the illustrated versions and reading them to our daughter. And
That's awesome. That's
yeah,
awesome. Cool. Well, thanks again, Drew. Like I said, it's been fantastic having you on the podcast. I think your insights in regards to intervention will be very beneficial to our audience, and you're shaping the way that substance use is treated. So, thanks again.
definitely. Thank you, Sean.